Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to divert from our normal curriculum to talk a little bit about not only interpersonal communication, but specifically nonverbal interpersonal communication. This is going to lay the foundational knowledge that we'll need to complete our next presentation assignment. Nonverbal communication is a form of communication that can help us master our body language. This is an article by Andrian Elopoulos in which he says, I'm pretty sure you have already heard the typical expression, almost 93% of our communication is nonverbal, that what you say doesn't really matter, that whether it is perceived is actually defined by a combination of our body language, tonality, and eye contact, rather than the actual words that we use. Another way to say that is whenever you convey a message, whether it be in a public speaking setting or in an informal interpersonal setting, you are sending multiple channels within a single message. And the vast majority of those are often nonverbal. So mastering nonverbal body language is an imperative if we want to convey meaning in an appreciable way in public speaking settings. So with that in mind, we're going to watch a brief segment from the popular television series Mr. Bean. After carefully watching the following sequence, I'd like you to identify examples of body, voice, space, and self-presentation in the sketch. Perhaps you can even analyze how nonverbal behavior alters these traits into meaningful communication.
Madame, elle est de bon. Vers nous, lucky. Et on got those
All right, folks. So you probably immediately noticed all of the non-verbal messages that made up the greater part of that particular communication setting. For example, you probably immediately noticed the juxtaposition in posture between Mr. Bean and all of the other figures. All of the other figures had arched, straight backs. They were looking forward, and this juxtaposed or amplified Mr. Bean's sluggishness or lethargy. You also probably noticed all of the gestures that Mr. Bean created, how some of those gestures even created objects that weren't there, such as the mucus inside of his jacket pocket. And finally, all of this creates meaning or humor because of the space. In a typical public setting, this probably wouldn't have derived as much comedy potential. But in a church, during a worship service, there is a certain amount of nonverbal decorum that is implied. And when Mr. Bean juxtaposes his behavior against those standards, it creates humor. So with that in mind, folks, what do you see here? 3 very different nonverbal expressions, but all of them convey very distinct meanings. And if you don't know what you're looking at, then what you are looking at are 3 flower girls that are all looking at the kiss during a wedding ceremony. Notice how different all of their postures, gestures, and other physical responses are, but how each of those very distinct patterns of nonverbal behavior convey equally distinct meaning. So, if we were to define what nonverbal communication is, we would probably call it the expression of meaningful messages via non-linguistic channels. Linguistic is the operative here, because it means that if there isn't codified linguistic ratio for the message, then it can qualify as nonverbal communication, which means that nonverbal communication can also envelop things like grunts and screams. So, with that in mind, what I'd like you to do is look at a series of non-verbal expressions and then place I love you as the verbal conceit in each of those images. In other words, I want you to imagine that each of the people in the images that I'm going to show you are saying I love you. So imagine if a person said I love you and held up a wedding ring. All of the non-verbal channels surrounding that message would probably imply that what they really meant by I love you was, will you marry me? If you saw a small girl say I love you right before kissing her puppy, what that would probably imply is, you're my best friend, or you're so sweet, or I'll take care of you. Now imagine if this person said I love you. That would probably have a drastically different meaning than the other two images. Same words, simple words, I love you. But the nonverbal context surrounding that message can dynamically, perhaps even radically change based upon all of the non-linguistic cues surrounding it. So, what are then the characteristics for identifying nonverbal communication? Typically, we would say that there are 4 dominant characteristics or traits, beginning with continuity, or the persistent sending of messages. That is another way of saying that humans, because most of our behaviors are nonverbal, are thus constantly sending nonverbal signals. Polyvalence refers to the fact that whenever we send messages, we're always sending them on multiple channels, and the majority of those channels, as we've already mentioned, are going to be non-linguistic. Ambiguity means that nonverbal messages are far less codified between different people and different cultures. In other words, the flick of a wrist might mean something very, very different, not only from people from different societies, but from individual people within those societies, based upon their own idiosyncrasies. And speaking of idiosyncrasies, nonverbal communication tends to be highly personal, because it allows us to use the very same language for unique expression, to convey our identities, and to establish our relationships. Think, for example, of a nickname or a pet name that you've given, a term of endearment that you've ascribed to your significant other or your bae. Could you use that exact same expression with someone else? My guess is that many terms of endearment that we use might sound offensive if we called someone else that same name, but because they're the pet names that we have for our significant other, we can use even seemingly offensive words or phrases, but the way we say them and the relationship and context in which they're delivered drastically change their meaning. So, what are some forms of nonverbal communication? Well, the first type of nonverbal communication that your course textbook speaks about is called proxemics, or the study of distance. And this is the impact of space among a distinct population, and is measured by interpersonal distance between speakers. Generally, we would say that intimate distance, or distance reserved for our closest friends, family, or even significant others, is allowing a person to touch us all the way to 18 inches to 1.5 feet. Personal distance tends to ascribe 1.5 feet to up to 4 feet. This is what we reserve for our acquaintances and friends in public settings. After that, we have what's called social distance. This is the distance that we often like to keep inasmuch as we are able in public social settings with other individuals. For example, if you have a classroom that seats 15, but you only have 6 students in it, chances are most of those students are going to want to spread themselves out over 4-foot increments. And finally, public distance is what we reserve for 12 to 25 feet. This is a very large distance and presumes that we don't necessarily know other people. So, if you're in a train station and there are only 2 people in that train station, instinctively, most of us will yield up to 12 feet of distance between ourselves and the other person. So why study proxemics? Because it's important for understanding how organizational territory operates within a society and a culture. This can be applied in things like research, film studies, advertising, and even cyberbullying. For example, if you notice in the next film or television series that you watch, whenever a producer or director wants us to experience empathy or the same feelings for a major character, they'll drift into a close-up shot of that person. Why? Because they want us to be intimate with that person's feelings, especially when they're expressing an emotion that will help us appreciate, understand, or feel for that person. So proxemics can also work on us on an interpersonal level. What you're looking at right now is what's called a coffin house or coffin box. Let me explain. Benjamin Haas actually spent a week in the Lucky House, which is a hotel in China that is encompassed singularly by these types of, get this, rooms. What you're seeing is a hotel room. When I enter my coffin for the first time, I immediately notice the strong, musty smell. I imagine the other residents in their bunks, each one roughly 60 centimeters, 2 feet wide, and 170 centimeters, or 5 feet and 7 inches long. With only enough space to sit up, living in such a confining space takes a mental toll. But my week pales in comparison to the other residents who have been living there for months, sometimes years. At night I can hear everything happening around me, every punch, kick, and scream from my neighbor's kung fu movie, the smacking of lips eating barbecue meat with rice, a brief argument over who will use the Seoul shower next, and, of course, a symphony of snoring. The next morning the sound of a plastic travel alarm clock first wakes me up at 5:30 a.m., but in my coffin there's almost no sense of time. It could be any hour of the day, and no natural light would reach me. For that, I would have to leave my bunk and walk to the sole window at the other end of the apartment. When I finally leave my coffin around 7:30 a.m., one of my neighbors is already prepping his first dose of meth for the day. Hong Kong's coffin homes have a reputation for danger and filth, sheltering convicted criminals and drug abusers, and in my short time, for roughly a quarter of the people regularly using drugs. So you can imagine how demoralizing and how dehumanizing living in a space like this could be, and how people and their operations on our proxemics can also change, sometimes dynamically, our relationships and the meaning that we convey in our messages. If you've ever known a person, for example, that was rehabilitated in a prison system, they might tend to eat their food in a very different way than others around them, because their understanding of proxemics is probably very different from yours. In addition to proxemics, nonverbal communication also refers to kinesics and haptics, or the study of gesture and touch, which we'll define as the interpretation of movement and touch when receiving messages. There are different types of gestures that we use. Probably the most prevalent are emblems, which are movement and touch with direct translations. So, if you've ever watched a football game, for example, and you've seen a referee give distinct movements for different signals, that's an example of an emblem. Illustrations are the ways that we, in everyday conversation, enhance or reinforce our words. So, for example, if you've ever been listing something for someone else and have held up a 1, do this, 2, do that, and 3, finish with this and that, then you've used an illustration to convey meaning. Regulation is how some individuals control communication and space. So, for example, if you've ever gone to a club, or if you've ever gone to a worship service for a religiously affiliated organization, and you've seen an usher at the very front entrance, that person is essentially operating as a gatekeeper, deciding who comes in and who doesn't, and what sort of behavior they should emulate whenever they do enter that space from another. And finally, kinesics and haptics are probably the dominant way that we release and convey feelings, through both gesture and touch. Think about the first time that your bae or your significant other held your hand, and how much meaning was conveyed in that very simple haptic moment. Gesture and touch can also express power dynamics within organizations. Oftentimes you can determine who the boss in any situation is based upon whether or not they're allowed to touch another person. And I don't just mean that in a #MeToo way. I mean, think about the last time a teacher or a supervisor or manager put their hand on someone's shoulder and said, "How are you doing today, buddy?" or "Things going all right?" Do you think that that employee or that student could do the same thing to that other person? Probably not, which tells us a little bit about the power dynamics within that organization. Finally, positive kinesic and haptic messages directly influence human perception. In other words, people that don't receive especially positive touch on a regular basis can often drastically change their communication, especially on an intrapersonal level. So let's look at chronomics, artifacts, and environment, or the study of time, objects, and space. We'll define this as deciphering the use of joint contexts, the spaces that we share, the time that we share, and the objects that are within that particular environment. Time is often deployed to convey authority, discretion, and priority. If you're having a meeting with someone and your topic is at the top of a docket, chances are that displays your premium or priority within that meeting. Personal appearance and properties can also express our personal and cultural identities. So in other words, the way that you wear your apparel, your hair, and what you carry with you says a lot about who you are and where you're from. And finally, our surroundings reveal relationships, values, and resources. Think about the last time you had to enter someone's office. Chances are they had certain pictures and items, perhaps even books, on their shelves decorating that office. And that was not just so they could remind themselves of who they were. They were deliberately trying to convey a certain persona or identity to those around them, whether it was through the size of their desk, the pictures of the vacations that they've taken, or the various books that they want other people to know that they've read. All of these are used as artifacts to convey meaning, even if they're never spoken about. So, how then do things like body language, gesture, affect how others see us? Believe it or not, it starts with how we can see ourselves. We're going to watch a brief segment from social psychologist Amy Cuddy, who argues for the use of what's called power posing, and how they can boost feelings of self-confidence, and how they also might have an effect or impact on our chances for success. So as you carefully watch the following segment, I'd like you to identify how Cuddy explains why posture and stance can impact communication. We'll start this particular segment a little bit later on in the actual speech.
So influenced by our nonverbals, our thoughts and our feelings and our physiology. So what nonverbals am I talking about? I'm a social psychologist, I study prejudice, and I teach at a competitive business school. So it was inevitable that I would become interested in power dynamics. I became especially interested in nonverbal expressions of power and dominance. And what are nonverbal expressions of power and dominance? Well, this is what they are. So in the animal kingdom, they are about expanding. So you make yourself big, you stretch out, you take up space, you're basically opening up. It's about opening up. And this is true across the animal kingdom. It's not just limited to primates, and humans do the same thing. So they do this both when they have power sort of chronically, and also when they're feeling powerful in the moment. And this one is especially interesting because it really shows us how universal and old these expressions of power are. This expression, which is known as pride, Jessica Tracy has studied, she shows that people who are born with sight and people who are congenitally blind do this when they win at a physical competition. So when they cross the finish line and they've won, it doesn't matter if they've never seen anyone do it, they do this. So the arm's up in the V, the chin is slightly lifted. What do we do when we feel powerless? We do exactly the opposite. We close up, we wrap ourselves up, we make ourselves small. We don't want to bump into the person next to us. So again, both animals and humans do the same thing. And this is what happens when you put together high and low power. So what we tend to do when it comes to power is that we complement the other's nonverbals. So if someone's being really powerful with us, we tend to make ourselves smaller. We don't mirror them, we do the opposite of them. So I'm watching this behavior in the classroom, and what do I notice? I notice that MBA students really exhibit the full range of power nonverbals. So you have people who are like caricatures of alphas, like really coming through the room. They get right into the middle of the room before class even starts, like they really want to occupy space. When they sit down, they're sort of spread out, they raise their hands like this. You have other people who are virtually collapsing when they come in. As soon as they come in, you see it. You see it on their faces and their bodies, and they sit in their chair and they make themselves tiny, and they go like this when they raise their hand. I noticed a couple things about this. One, you're not going to be surprised. It seems to be related to gender. So, women are much more likely to do this kind of thing than men. Women feel chronically less powerful than men, so this is not surprising. But the other thing I noticed is that it also seemed to be related to the extent to which the students were participating and how well they were participating. And this is really important in the MBA classroom because participation counts for half the grade. So, business schools have been struggling with this gender grade gap. You get these equally qualified women and men coming in, and then you get these differences in grades, and it seems to be partly attributable to participation. So I started to wonder, okay, so you have these people coming in like this and they're participating. Is it possible that we could get people to fake it, and would it lead them to participate more? So my main collaborator, Dana Carney, who's at Berkeley, and I really wanted to know, can you fake it till you make it? Like, can you do this just for a little while and actually experience a behavioral outcome that makes you seem more powerful? So we know that our nonverbals govern how other people think and feel about us. There's a lot of evidence, but our question really was, do our nonverbals govern how we think and feel about ourselves? There's some evidence that they do. So, for example, when we smile when we feel happy, but also when we're forced to smile by holding a pen in our teeth like this, it makes us feel happy. So it goes both ways. When it comes to power, it also goes both ways. So when you feel powerful, you're more likely to do this, but it's also possible that when you pretend to be powerful, you are more likely to actually feel powerful. So the second question really was, so we know that our minds change our bodies, but is it also true that our bodies change our minds? And when I say minds in the case of powerful, what am I talking about? So I'm talking about thoughts and feelings and the sort of physiological things that make up our thoughts and feelings, and in my case, that's hormones. I look at hormones. So what do the minds of the powerful versus the powerless look like? So powerful people tend to be, not surprisingly, more assertive and more confident, more optimistic. They actually feel that they're going to win even at games of chance. They also tend to be able to think more abstractly, so there are a lot of differences. They take more risks. There are a lot of differences between powerful and powerless people. Physiologically, there also are differences on two key hormones, testosterone, which is the dominance hormone, and cortisol, which is the stress hormone. So what we find is that high-power alpha males in primate hierarchies have high testosterone and low cortisol, and powerful and effective leaders also have high testosterone and low cortisol. So what does that mean? When you think about power, people tended to think only about testosterone because that was about dominance. But really, power is also about how you react to stress. So do you want the high-power leader that's dominant, high on testosterone, that's really stress-reactive? Probably not, right? You want the person who's powerful and assertive and dominant, but not very stress-reactive, the person who's laid back. So we know that in primate hierarchies, if an alpha needs to take over, if an individual needs to take over an alpha role sort of suddenly, within a few days, that individual's testosterone has gone up significantly and its cortisol has dropped significantly. So we have this evidence, both that the body can shape the mind, at least at the facial level, and also that role changes can shape the mind. So what happens if you take a role change? What happens if you do that at a really minimal level, like this tiny manipulation, this tiny intervention? For 2 minutes you say, I want you to stand like this, and it's going to make you feel more powerful. So this is what we did. We decided to bring people into the lab and run a little experiment. And these people adopted for 2 minutes either high power poses or low power poses. And I'm just going to show you 5 of the poses, although they took on only 2. So here's one, a couple more. This one has been dubbed the Wonder Woman by the media. Here are a couple more. So you can be standing or you can be sitting. And here are the low power poses. So you're folding up, you're making yourself small. This one is very low power. When you're touching your neck, you're really kind of protecting yourself. So this is what happens. They come in, they spit into a vial. We, for 2 minutes, say, you need to do this or this. They don't look at pictures of the poses. We don't want to prime them with the concept of power. We want them to be feeling power, right? So 2 minutes they do this. We then ask them, how powerful do you feel on a series of items? And then we give them an opportunity to gamble. And then we take another saliva sample. That's it. That's the whole experiment. So this is what we find. Risk tolerance, which is the gambling. What we find is that when you're the high power pose condition, 86% of you will gamble. When you're in the low power pose condition, only 60%, and that's a pretty whopping significant difference. Here's what we find on testosterone. From their baseline when they come in, high power people experience about a 20% increase, and low power people experience about a 10% decrease. So again, 2 minutes and you get these changes. Here's what you get on cortisol. High power people experience about a 25% decrease, and the low power people experience about a 15% increase. So 2 minutes lead to these hormonal changes that configure your brain to basically be either assertive, confident, and comfortable, or really stress reactive, and feeling sort of shut down. And we've all had that feeling, right?
So based upon what Cuddy has said, there's an important understanding. We often presume that whenever we send a linguistic signal, we're also in charge of all of the nonverbal cues that surround it. The proposition that Cuddy is revealing in this presentation is the fact that oftentimes our nonverbal behaviors can influence what we say by giving us either feelings of power or weakness, cortisol or testosterone. So it is possible to fake it while you make it, and that's an important consideration to take into mind as we continue to prepare for both informal and formal presentations. We often presume that we can only exude confidence, for example, during a speech if we're feeling it on the inside. But according to Cuddy, if we'll just practice demonstrating confidence, it will actually produce confidence on a molecular, chemical level inside of us. So how then do we interpret nonverbal communication? Well, it's important to consider cultural, social, and individual factors. For example, people from different cultures, ethnicity, and backgrounds will have drastically different interpretations of sometimes the same gestures or even tone of voice. We also need to view messages as a unified whole rather than discrete signals. Remember, oftentimes nonverbal signals are only one channel within a larger polyvalent message. So if one of those channels contradicts or juxtaposes against the rest of the message, chances are we should trust the message as a whole rather than a single discrete signal. Finally, identify the muscular impacts of messages. What's the relationship, the environment, or the purpose of this message? And if you can discern or divine the purpose of that particular sign or signal, chances are you can better interpret the meaning behind the nonverbal factors. And, of course, deploy persistent feedback during and after communication. Remember, we distinguish between feedback, which is just verifying you've understood what a person has said, and criticism, which is offering judgment or observations about what they have said. Deploying feedback or putting in your own words what another person may mean can often overcome any roadblocks in nonverbal communication. Well, folks, that's it for today's lecture. We will have a discussion journal that's associated with this particular segment, and I look forward to reading your responses.